Scarlett.
Well, she's a non-voting member, so I don't know that. I think we're waiting for Ted is the only person I know of that has not communicated with me about not attending.
And there's no one in the council chambers, right, Kristen, that are members of the EFC?
There is no one in the council chambers at this time, Chris.
Oh, I thought you said there was. I'm sorry.
Oh, the computer is set up. You can see it in attendees council chambers public comment. So the computer's set up, the video is being live streamed in the council chambers right now. There's just no one present.
Okay.
Kristen, I know Ted had indicated some difficulty receiving messages. Did you close the loop on that issue?
Yes, Chuck, I did receive an email from him today confirming that he received the panelist link.
Okay. That's good.
There he is. We're good to go.
Okay.
Okay. So we will. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the joint study session meeting of the Winnetka Village Council and the Environmental and Forestry Commission. I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask that you please mute your excuse me, cell phones and other electronic devices. And when you're not speaking, if you could mute your microphone, that will help improve the sound quality of the meeting. First order of business is to ask our village manager to do a roll call of village council.
Certainly. Thank you, Chris. Trustee Lampier,
Yes.
trustee Apatow,
Here.
trustee Mancini,
Here.
trustee Kripe,
Here.
trustee Swerk. But he was
Where'd he go?
here. Trustee Swerk.
He was
Okay.
there.
There was a message that he left the meeting. I don't know.
Okay. President Rentz.
Present. Okay, Chuck, you can ask the same question now.
Yes, I'd like to call the Environmental Commission to order and have Andrew Lewick request a roll call.
All right, Chairperson Dowding,
Here?
Commissioner Foley, absent. Commissioner Varka,
Absent.
Commissioner Park Jones,
Absent.
Commissioner Winnichenko,
Present.
Commissioner Kunkel,
Present.
Commissioner Sylvester,
Absent.
and Student Representative Buccellato, absent, and Student Representative Harper.
Here.
We're good to go. Okay, we'll move forward with public comment. Now is the time of the meeting when members of the public can address village council and I guess the EFC on any item that is not on tonight's agenda. So Kristen, would you like to petition everybody to see if somebody wants to speak to us on an item not on the agenda?
Yes, President Rentz, and I'd also like to note that there were no written public comments submitted in advance of the meeting tonight.
Thank you.
So at this time, if you are attending via the Zoom platform and would like to make a comment on an item not on the agenda, if you would please raise your hand using Zoom.
Hey, for the record, I finally made it. I was having trouble with the sound, sorry.
I see no hands raised, President Rentz.
Okay, so we will close public comment and move forward to the Soup du jour. Item 3, Parkway planting policy discussion. The Village Council has sought the assistance of the Environmental and Forestry Commission to help clarify the village's regulations for parkway planting installations. Tonight, during this joint meeting of the EFC and Village Council, we'll discuss the recommendations developed by the EFC during their study of the issue. Here to review are the EFC chairperson, Chuck Dowding, and the Village Forestry, Andrew Look. Now, before we go off, I just want to say I was absolutely blown away by the work that the commission provided us with. I mean, this is so thoughtful and thorough, and you know, you guys have really made life easy for us, and it's really appreciated to know that we can, you know, turn these sort of matters over to our advisory commissions and then come back with this sort of work in hand. It was really, really encouraging. And of course, I wouldn't have expected any less from your group, Chuck, but just great work all the way around. So I'll turn it over to you and Andrew, and you can kind of walk us through the report.
Okay. Well, I'd like to begin with a little bit of background of our 4-month-long study. We devoted 4 of our monthly meetings to preparation and recommendations to the Village Council regarding plantings on the village parkways that would yield positive benefits for the village. But while maintaining consistency with neighborhood aesthetics, not interfering with village utilities, snow removal, pedestrian, biker, and motor vehicle safety. We focused 4 meetings on this issue. In January, we investigated and discussed preferred plantings. In February, we looked at the experience of other local communities. On March, we investigated pertinent Winnetka ordinances in addition to the one dealing specifically with parkway plantings. And then in April, we summarized our findings in a meeting, and the minutes of that meeting are included in the agenda packet for this evening. We announced this plan and procedure in early January before our first meeting, and have adhered to this plan and have, of course, invited the village to participate in our deliberations. In this procedure, we investigated the details of parkway planting procedures in Bannockburn, Evanston, Highland Park, Kenilworth, Oak Park, Shaker Heights, Wellesley, Wilmette, Seattle, and Winnetka, and have prepared summaries of the findings, and those have been given to the village forester as part of the official record. You have the results in your agenda packet. I'm not sure I need to go through them. However, I would like to say that probably attachment number 2, pages 6 and 7, probably best summarize the findings of the commission. Let's see, as soon as I can find them myself. Here we go. I would like to say, though, that in summary is that we provided rather than specific recommendations based on principles. And the main reason for this principle-based set of recommendations is to allow the staff to have leeway to apply these principles in unusual situations, as we felt it would be too constraining and too difficult to be specific in terms of our recommendations. So with that, well, I do have one other or 2 other things I'd like to say. Not included in the 4 principle-based determinations for preferred plantings is the term edible vegetables. The the reason that was originally included. However, discussion within the commission itself indicated there was some reticence on the part of the commission in terms of the challenges with regard to fruit-based vegetables that might attract animals and prove unsightly. And as a result of that, the commission decided not to include that particular type of preferred planting. However, to leave vegetables in the document that Commissioner Kunkel and her assistant Matt Evans prepared, because they specifically focused on leafy vegetables and root vegetables, which would be less of a problem with regard to the other principles that were espoused in our guidelines. And so I think that's the only elaboration that I think needs to be done. However, if you have questions, I and the other two members of the commission would be happy to answer them.
Sure. Andrew, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. I mean, the commission did a good job of sort of clarifying what was asked. There were sort of 7 different topics that were voted on at the last meeting, and so I think, and it's all in the packet in the agenda item. But the pruning process and developing the recommended planting list, and I, as the forester, sort of looked that over too, and I agree with what's in there, that it's not a final list, but a good starting point and recommendations, and did a good job with taking into account neighboring community experiences and processes. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So we're glad to answer any questions you might have. So
Maybe I have one additional comment to make, and maybe Liz would like to follow on this, is that the preferred plantings are mainly native hardy local plants. It's not an inclusive list. So I think that needs to be taken into account when you look at the plants that are recommended for that particular category. It's not a limited list. It's not completely inclusive. There's many other types of plants that can be employed in Parkway plantings.
Okay, Liz, you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Chris. President Rintz.
Chris.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. I do not have anything specific to add. I would like to say, Chuck referred to my assistant. That is not, that's a great term. The person who helped fit more than 50%. I am not a plant person. I want to know this work. I want to do it, but I'm not an expert in anything native plants. That's not how I come at sustainability. So we are lucky enough in Winnetka to have Matt Evans. He's the attendee in the meeting tonight, listed as the Friends IL Nature Preserves. So Matt grew up in Winnetka. He lives in Highland Park now, but his family's still here in Winnetka. He expressed interest in our Go Green Winnetka group a number of years ago, but was too busy completing his master's degree at Northwestern in plant biology, I believe, if not something else, to get connected with the Go Green group. So we fortuitously reconnected last summer. And I want him to be able to speak to the list because he can do it much more accurately than I can, because he is much of the origin of the types of plants and why we chose what we did came through Matt. So I would really like to elevate him in this conversation if we may. He's a much better speaker to this issue than I am. Thank you.
Sure. Kristen, you want to bring Matt in? And in the meantime, Scarlett and Ted, do you have anything else you'd like to add to the presentation at this point in time? I mean, we're going to be talking for a while, but if you have any opening thoughts on the process or where you ended up, that would be helpful.
I guess I would just add that I pointed out to Chuck that in the packet that you have, one of the points was not what we kind of agreed on during the last meeting, and that's under number 3, the surface of a rain garden should generally be level. It said maximum deviation of 3 to 6 inches. We made the wording of that more vague and adjustable, something I think to the effect of that it just has to be graded appropriately for pedestrian traffic or something like that.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to bring that up just in case you're looking at the packet.
Sure. Scarlett, would you like to add anything?
Not too many on the specifics here. I think it's super exciting that we might be making this an option for parkways.
So do I. That's why we're having the conversation. Matt, can you help us understand why you did what you did?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me tonight. Why did I do what I did? So I am passionate about solutions to modern stormwater and other sustainability problems that are related to environmental issues and solutions. And so through my work, I think about things a lot on the landscape side and whether or not our current landscapes are up to the potential that they could be in terms of helping us solve some of our problems. And so that is why I did what I did, because I think that all of the turf grass and surfaces in the world now that are made of concrete and asphalt are just a problem that is solvable for stormwater through innovative and sometimes maybe what seems like more rudimentary means, planting back native plants and stuff like that. And so I think that just approaching this sort of long Winnetka stormwater issue from my expertise made a lot of sense for this conversation. And so I think that's why Liz and I connected about this. And yeah, that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability, and I'm just happy to be here. And I'm also, like Scarlett, excited that you guys are talking about this. It's
Yeah.
great to see in my hometown.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks for joining the conversation. That's great. Okay, now we'll open it up for the free for all, and I see Penny's already waving her hand, so you can kick it off, Penny. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. This is great. What a excellent conversation to be having. And thanks you guys for all of the work that has been put into this. I just have a couple questions. One, I guess, pertains to the notion of Parkway that we're talking about. And certainly there are two types in the village. One is the Parkway that's between a sidewalk and the street. And then, of course, for all the streets that don't have sidewalks, for the Parkway that is you know, it's a different kind of a planting situation. You know, I can think of an example right around the corner from me where on Chestnut Street, where actually part of the, you know, there's a big pitch away from the street, which would be a perfect place to have a rain garden. So I'm looking at the discussion of what the deviation and slope would be, and it would be really awkward to apply that kind of a metric on a yard that does not have a sidewalk built into it. So I would advocate, you know, I mean, we need to think that staff needs to think about that a little more deeply in terms of how to make it applicable across the village. The other question that I have is thinking about this, that, you know, our growing season here is very short, and that, you know, at least 6-7 months of the year, you know, plants die back, and we really are looking at a situation where we're looking for ground cover, because particularly where there are sidewalks, that the part between the sidewalk and the street can get a lot of foot traffic. You know, people, because the sidewalks aren't necessarily wide enough for a bike, you know, a cyclist and a pedestrian to pass or whatever. So I'm wondering if you all thought about that, and thinking about, for example, planting leafy vegetables or annual flowers. What can we do as a part of the requirements to ensure that we maintain the soil integrity and that we have ground cover 12 months out of the year?
Chuck, why don't you go ahead and deal that off as you see fit, or answer it yourself?
Well, let me just say that we tried to deal with that in terms of the principles as opposed to specific issues. I think, Penny, you brought up a very good reason for having principles rather than specifics because of the difference between a property with a sidewalk and one without a sidewalk. We felt that so far that the village staff had dealt with this pretty adequately in terms of allowing certain plantings to be had on the platted land which belongs to the village, but is still contiguous to the property owner's property there. And I agree, it's a different situation altogether. And that's why I don't think you can be specific, because there's no way to be specific about every single right of way in the town. So that's why we tried to be principle based as opposed to specify something. And I think you bring up a second point about the ground cover and having a walkable surface year round. I think it's a very, very important property, and that's why Ted was wanted to ensure that you all understood that our principle is that the rain gardens be designed so that pedestrian safety is maintained, and that's what I'm worried about is that the minute you specify a given slope or some specific thing like that, there will be an issue. Right, someone will come up with a slope that's different than that, and then it'll become difficult to define. So I agree with you that pedestrian safety is very important in these issues. And I think there's also the trip and fall hazard problem, which is architect's bane of existence. For a $1,000 fee, you wind up with a $10 million liability because somebody trips on your whatever you've got on your own property. The challenge is that's village property, and that then becomes a village issue. So
and relative to plantings, I really like the idea that we're recommending people think about things different than just turf grass. How do we ensure that there will be something there to provide ground cover for 12 months out of the year?
So can I have to raise my hand.
Jump in, Ted.
Oh, I guess, yeah, I guess I would say that, these are, I think, these are going to be things that are going to be kind of opposed to each other, right? Like we first talking about the slope, in the meeting minutes, the wording that we came up, rain garden grading to be sufficient to maintain safe pedestrian traffic consistent with village ordinances with respect to grading. So the idea that, staff could look at any given place and see what the grading is like there, and then any changes to that, to not be excessive or detrimental. But I think inherent in the idea of putting things other than turf down on the Parkway is the idea that some of it won't be walkable. When you drop a tree in the Parkway, you can't walk through the tree as it gets bigger. Similarly, if you're going to encourage people to plant things that aren't turf grass, you're going to have plants that are going to get taller and they're going to be harder to walk through at some point in the year. And then in the winter, you want to encourage people not to cut down at the end of the season, but rather in the spring. But there'll be times where that coverage isn't there. So you might have some exposed topsoil with roots underneath it that might get muddy and might be more difficult to walk on. But I think that's kind of like that's a decision that the council will have to make about how important is it to have consistent 12 months a year walkability, because if that's the primary driver, then really you're limited, very limited in what you'll be able to put down.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. I also noticed you guys were struggling with the definition of Parkway. And in one of the minutes, I know that there was a lot of discussion on, what constitutes a parkway. And then maybe we need to consider defining the space a little bit better in the ordinance so that we have a clear understanding of what we're actually talking about, which is something to consider as well. So go ahead.
I looked throughout our village ordinances, and there isn't any definition really anywhere of that. So I think it is a good thing for us to define, because it's a term that we use without any reference or context specifically. So that's a good.
Yeah, and that's something that Chuck brought up in his comments dated May 5th, is to ensure the definition of village-owned right-of-way is clear with respect to parkways.
Right.
And not only parkways, it really has to be explained. A right-of-way is a right-of-way that occurs where you have alleys. I have a house in my alley that has a garden in the alley all the way to the edge of the concrete alley, built up with fence posts up so the neighbor doesn't back in and knock over his plants. That is about 4 feet over his property line in the right of way of the alley. And there's a little mini war going on between the two. So he puts these posts up, and he's got little chicken wire fences that get bent over, because for the guy to get out of the garage, those plants are in the way. So although we're thinking of this as front parkway, it should be really to any right of way that's not ownership of the land parcel of the homeowner.
Gotcha.
Somehow defined.
That's a good point, John.
Thanks.
I had at one point considered, being very specific, saying, well, you have to have 36 inches from the curb so that someone's door can swing open if they're parked there. That's a big issue. You don't want to have rocks or plants that prohibit someone from opening their door so that the passenger can exit the car.
Sure.
So there's 36 inches that you shouldn't be planting in. And then there's what I would call sort of an escape alley on the side of the sidewalk, where you can get out of the way when the kids riding their bicycles to school are riding down the sidewalk, and somebody has to yield. If you're walking there, you either got to get out of the way or the student does, and there has to be room. Ted points out the fact, well, there are trees there. Well, but there needs to be some way there. So there's maybe another 2 feet street side of the sidewalk that can't be planted on. But I'm thinking that perhaps that could be commentary with regard to the staff taking this into account, because I don't think we can define every piece of property specifically. It would be really difficult.
Right.
You've already pointed out exceptions, right? I'm sure the longer we talk, the more exceptions that will arise.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Chuck. That makes total sense. By the time you take 3 feet off the curb line for a door and an X amount of distance off the sidewalk, it might leave you 3 feet in some parkways to do something.
Well,
but I totally agree with that. So one question I had too, with respect to, private ownership building on right of way, does the village have a consultant they can use to discuss the insurance ramifications of us approving something that's put in a right of way, but then now we're liable?
The other villages, and I would imagine that it includes Winnetka, have a rather arduous multi-step process if you wish to build something in the parkway. Probably the most recent example is the 5G equipment that's going in everywhere. So basically, if we talk to Highland Park, and they have, I know you have to get like 3 or 4 permits, and you have to indemnify the village as part of the process. So I would imagine that would still also apply in Winnetka if you wish to build something.
That's a very good point. They can indemnify the village and add it to their homeowners policy.
Right.
And then, and see if that's possible. That's a great point, Chuck. Thanks.
You have any thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, so I think that an indemnity would be certainly something that we would always recommend. where the homeowner is going, if they want to plant something or install something, that there's something that, that they're indemnifying the village. But there's also, and this should help provide some assurance, is that the Local Government Tort Immunity Act does have immunities that do protect the village, so long as it doesn't know or have reason to know about a dangerous condition. So if, so take the classic example, which is a crack in the sidewalk. The mere fact that there may be a crack in the sidewalk doesn't create liability to the village. It's if it's reported, we know about it, and then we ignore it and don't repair it. The same thing would generally apply here, that if there's something in the parkway that's planted and we have no reason to believe that that planting is dangerous or a hazard for somebody falling, then we do have protections. It's when it's reported to us, then we would have an affirmative obligation to do something to abate a nuisance or a hazard.
Yeah, but the way to look at that though is, sorry, Rob.
No problem.
The way to look at that, I guess, let's just pretend that we're going to approve a rock or a rain garden in the parkway. They might have 12 inches of stone or something to the edge by the sidewalk that begins to slope down into this rain garden. And someone on a rainy day has to go off the sidewalk a little bit, hits that slippery rock, falls on a bike, something happens.
Yeah.
Approving that installation, we've approved the condition.
Right. That's exactly where
versus having just grass.
That's exactly where I was going, John. If we approve it, if we give consent, that changes the game.
Right.
Well, that brings up the difficult term structure. And I would submit that anything other than soil ought to be considered a structure.
Or plant.
Or plant, right. Anything other than soil or plant ought to be considered a structure. And that, and we're trying to create a pathway, a simple pathway for people to put ground cover and plants on the parkway. And we don't want to get into the indemnification issue, because there is a pathway for that if you really want to build something that impedes access. So remember, I think there are pathways in place to indemnify the village and whatnot, I believe already. What we're trying to produce here is a simple way for people to put soil and plants in the parkway. And I think one way to do that is to really make structure very tightly worded, that there isn't soil and plants, there is a structure.
So anything that is flush with the ground is considered a structure. So if somebody puts down like 3 bricks to walk across the parkway, or as you said, gravel or something like that, those are all considered structures.
I think that already people are allowed to have a sidewalk from the curb to the main sidewalk, access walkway. So that would have to be worked out in terms of.
Yeah, I just was clarifying, so, okay.
So you already can do that, so that's already allowed. But what we're talking about are other rocks.
Yeah, so
more planters is, I was talking about this to a landscape architecture friend. He started listing all the ways in which people would try to work their way around the prohibition of the structure.
Okay. Got it.
Right.
I also just wanted to point out that the village already must have some sort of process, because the community development department approved at least one little library built in the parkway of that street north of New Trier that has like the middle of the street is like a huge parkway. There's a little library in there, and I've been told that structure was approved by community development. So there must be.
There is
I will say that I personally advocated for that installation.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that that's great. I just think that there must be some sort of process there.
Right.
There is a process. There has always been a process. And it's apparently not always realized by our residents, but there is a process. Yeah, I just wanted to point out for attendees that are listening, you guys have referenced the principles, and I really like what you did. And I thought it might make some sense. Just to briefly summarize, when you guys talk about the sort of recommended plantings and ground covers, what you've recommended are things that are native, drought resistant, to decrease the use of water and fertilizers. Really important, because primarily we're worried about water quality going into our rivers, right? That attract pollinators and butterflies. That's a big issue right now. We know we've got a pollinator problem, so I love that. Require less maintenance, so we don't have the big gas mowers going. That's awesome. And are perennial, so kind of addressing that concern about annual plantings that you constantly have to turn over. Perennials, the great thing about them is you're going to get stronger roots year after year, and hopefully that's going to improve soil erosion. A lot of the Kentucky bluegrass that goes in town is technically perennial, but really not well suited to the conditions around here. So, just kind of, I love those principles. I see that you also agreed with the recommendation from Steve as far as structures, and so we're not actually talking about expanding, and maybe we can talk later about kind of the logic behind it. I agree with where you came down on that, by the way. I think it's thoughtful. There's one other thing that we haven't talked about before, and doing my kind of homework preparing for this tonight, it dawned on me. We have a tree preservation code, and there's actually some significant overlap that didn't dawn on me until I was kind of preparing for tonight, but it's section 15.28.070. It's our tree preservation and protection code. And it actually regulates what you can do under the protection zone or under the drip line of the tree. So if you look at that, and then what I want you to do is look at Google Maps and try to find a spot in the village of Winnetka where you see the ground. I'm telling you, almost every inch of Parkway in this village is under the drip line. And so I think the work you've done is great in focusing on the planning, but we have an extra layer of protection because of that tree code. And I also looked at, I'm glad you guys looked at what Evanston did, because I spent some time looking at what they did as well. They considered the idea of the raised planters, and they put trees first, because nothing is going to absorb more CO2. Nothing is going to filter water better than a big old tree, because they suck up a lot of water. And so they prioritized the trees. And on the raised plantings, they raised the concern that the impact, you're going to compact the soil if you put those things under the drip line. And so I like the way you addressed the structure thing, but I didn't want it to go without being said that we also have another line of defense, a very important one. And these things, I think, work together well. Maybe we can cross-reference them somehow. Probably not a lot of people spend time perusing our village code, but great work though. Thank you.
That's a great point. That's really interesting.
So Andy, based on that,
yeah,
are they not supposed to plant anything below those drip lines?
So there's like any structure in a parkway, there's actually a permit process. And if you do want to put anything under a drip line, you're supposed to talk to the village forester, get an assessment of whether it could impact the health of the tree.
Okay.
And then work through it that way.
Interesting. Thanks. That is a good. Thank you.
Am I wrong in that our native plants, which draw the water down, are deep rooted, those are good for trees, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to impact the roots. They're going to, I think what you worry about is compacting the soil, diverting water away from the tree roots, and that sort of thing. So as long as people aren't digging deep holes to put in plantings, you want gentle planting, of course. People going into the parkway, the rototiller on top of the roots. But yeah.
But I saw that, Chris, you were about to say something. Sorry.
I was just wondering. Kim's been kind of quiet. I'm to get her in the conversation too. So.
Yeah, well, Andy, that's such an interesting point, and I'm curious what Andrew's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, as Andy mentioned, any sort of permit for getting a structure, anything in the parkway, or really, or it goes for private property too, for putting anything underneath the drip line of a tree. If it's going to impact the tree to a point where it's going to be detrimental, then we're going to maybe move it or adjust it or not approve it. So that could go for a patio, or it could go for any other structure where there's a gradient there. So if you're putting something underneath a tree, it's not necessarily detrimental to the point where it can't happen, but for it to be allowed, it would have to be reviewed, and definitely wouldn't, if you're taking up 20 to 30% or more of the permeable drip line of a tree with a structure, at that point, you're really impacting the tree. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely be reviewing all of these, any type of planting, whether it's a structure or if it's perennials or anything else that go in there, to make sure that they're not detrimental to our parkway trees or to private trees as well.
But if I read, thank you, if I read the ordinance correctly, there, you could allow things up to 30 inches tall. Isn't that by nature going to be something with a root ball or something that will be potentially impacting digging? So I guess my thought is, why would we allow something that tall if we want to make sure that we just do what you said we don't want to do, which is impacting anything?
Yeah, I'd like to hear what Matt has to say on that. That's interesting.
Milkweed, milkweed.
Yes,
No.
well, milkweed is a really big deal. 30 inches was chosen because that's low for native plants, pretty much. And one thing that I think is important to consider here is that not all plantings require digging. You seed your turf grass in, so that is no reason that that can't be done with native plantings as well.
And that's what I was saying before with the, I have some passion and interest in this because it was our family business, still is our family business. So yeah, that's why you don't go pounding with a rototiller over tree roots. You seed.
Interesting.
I'm also curious. I know there's a lot of questions about the rain gardens and whatnot. Would this be an opportunity for an education campaign? I had never even heard of these two things until I read this packet. I had to look them up of what they meant and how they were beneficial. If it's something that would be encouraging, I'm curious how we'd be explaining it to laymen. And then two, as someone who does not have a sidewalk on my side of the street, and Penny brought this up, and I've actually had a question because we have a lot of very old trees that one of them needs to come down, and it's technically on the village's dime to remove it. I somehow didn't even know exactly how far back my grass started. So we have a big front yard, and I think a lot of people may be confused as to how much of that is technically, getting a tape measure out. What does that look like in terms of this stuff?
Yeah.
Well,
Thoughts? Go ahead,
well, I think there are two ways to do that. If your neighbors have been selling their home, there would have been surveyors out pounding orange colored stakes into making crosses on whatever sidewalk you had. So that's a first clue. The second one would be to call the village engineer's office, and they can give you an AutoCAD drawing of the rights of way adjacent to your property. So that's not that I'm the village engineer, but that's my profession. I'm a civil engineer. So
it should be on your plat of survey too, shouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think I'm more talking in terms of if we're all going to be following the same rules, right? It's very obvious when there's a sidewalk and then grass and then a street, that's the village, and it's commonplace for people to be moving about it. I, in theory, should be following the exact same rules as everybody else. And yes, these are principles, and I love that they're principles for discretion for the village to take hold of. But I just wanted to make it a little bit more clear to have a more even playing field, I guess, with regards to, I still don't technically own 20 feet or 25 feet of the front part of my land.
Kim, you bring up a really good point, which has been sort of like a bugaboo of mine for a long time, in terms of people understanding if there isn't a sidewalk, what is the village right of way, and what can and can't they do with that. And that's sort of been part of the problem with trying to finish our sidewalk network, is that people thought it was theirs, and so spent a lot of money landscaping it, and then we run into problems. So that's one issue. And the other issue is relative to maintenance. We have it because people don't really necessarily understand what their responsibility is in terms of maintaining their trees and shrubs alongside the sidewalk. And so, that's something to deal with too. So I think that you're right, there's a lot of education that we need to be doing. And so this is hopefully setting the framework, so if we have something in place in terms of what our policies are, and then that gives us a place to start, but for an education campaign. But I think it's really exciting. I think there's a lot of stuff. And I'm wondering, just to jump off of your question about education campaigns, is these are really great ideas in terms of starting examples around town, or having photos, or how can we help people visualize what this will look like? Do you all have examples that we ought to be turning to?
Well, Steve had a number of examples in his pack that he presented to the village council in December. There were a number of examples of plantings on rights of way for properties that didn't have a sidewalk and that had a sidewalk, and he had examples of things where there were taller plants and
right.
Shorter plants. I think he even had a photograph of Ted's rain garden.
Yeah.
So yes, there are these. The staff has a collection of these already. The EFC has produced Penny, I think you were our liaison at that time. We had a document that describes how to go ahead and build rain gardens and whatnot on your property. So that is also in existence. And then Liz, could you chime in about the Gardens at Work program that you sponsor every year?
Well, sure. Thanks, Chuck. So again, it's our Go Green Winnetka group, and it's actually an initiative started by Go Green Wilmette. They've done a sustainable yard tour for the last 7 or 8 years. They had done it so long that last year they were able to shift theirs both to a virtual presentation. And I found out today that was so successful that they're going to continue filming the yards. They had 1,200 views on their YouTube channel of the Sustainable Yard Tour they hosted last year, which they arranged on a smaller scale in a timed entry sort of fashion last year. Go Green Winnetka being a smaller, more recent group, we had done 2 yard tours. We call ours the Yards That Work tour because it's specifically getting your space to work for you, whatever your need is, making it work. So like I said, we did it 2018 and 19, and we were not far along in 2020 to try to shift in any way last year. And I decided it's not worth trying to do it this year. Again, as we're emerging, I don't want to start a conversation with people about inviting strangers onto their property this summer. So we are not going to do that. But Go Green Winnetka is, we're hoping to host our first annual native plant sale in the fall or late summer, which will be bookending a sale that, again, Go Green Wilmette has been doing for a number of years. They just had theirs this Saturday. They sold 3,100 plants in less than an hour. They could sell more. They just don't want to. Honestly, it's like, they're like, please, somebody else do it. We can't do more. But so the purpose of these sustainable yard tours, whatever they're called, is educational, obviously, and best practices and a way to get people to see what can be done. And so Wilmette, again, has had many more of those. And in terms of examples, Penny, there aren't a lot of examples in Winnetka of Parkway plantings. So there weren't, examples. We didn't want to draw a lot on examples from other communities if we're focusing on Winnetka. So I do have some pictures of native plants in Parkway spaces, specifically in Wilmette, but they were sort of random, and frankly in the winter, which is not the best light in which to see those spaces. Right. So, but that the sustainable yard tour and the Yards That Work tour that we do, and frankly the native plant sale, will all be about the educational piece, one part of the educational piece. I've always been about that piece personally. I very much want to connect the dots for people. And Kim, I'm like you could hear, I'm a total layperson, novice on this. I don't even speak the language at all. Everything I've learned has been in the last couple years of doing these, going to plant sales and going to presentations like Matt, hosts, like he's a presenter at. We're learning, definitely. But yeah, I think I also like, as part of the educational campaign, I'm a big fan of guides of like, we have our recycling guide, like a 1-2 page front and back, down and dirty, highlights, here's what you need to know, like sort of how to get started on a solar thing. It's that same high level headline kind of view of something, so so people know where to start, and can know the resources to use to have a successful experience.
Because I think that the sustainability tab on our website is a great place to put this information. I think some of it is under the stormwater, under the stormwater tab, which isn't where people would go to look for it. Because, I think that all that we can do to help people make it as simple as possible to imagine what they can do is great, because these are such good ideas.
I'd like to add, for Kim's sake, and Kim, tell me if you already know this. I mean, this whole right-of-way planting thing has been really no issue, probably as far as I know, for 100+ years at Winnetka, until the recent structure that went up that kind of caused us to all take a look at this. And tell me if I'm wrong, somebody. Right?
Well, actually,
it really was the start.
Well, EFC actually has been doing work on this, as Chuck said, for a while.
Right.
And part of it was kicked off because of the requirements from, I guess it's from, I don't know what it, in terms of our stormwater management plans that we have.
Right, from the rain garden and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, right.
But
So what are we going to do about our public? So it came at a good time to bring it all together.
Right,
Yeah.
but puts it in a different eye.
Yeah.
So, and I guess somewhere in our definitions of the right of way, it should be somewhere in there that you're only allowed to get a permit for the right of way 90 degrees adjacent to your property. Because I had brought this up, when this all started, it's a public right of way. Can I go 3 houses down and put a garden in front of my house?
Right.
I mean, you just never know.
Right.
Now's the time to make sure that doesn't happen. Or I can go downtown Winnetka and put a garden somewhere because it's right of way. It's not their property. And maybe clarify that they acknowledge that right of way or the parkway, whatever you call it, is not their property. It's a very, very clear point. And as far as the depth, I saw this 6 inches, and that might make sense. I think we have to defer that a little bit to Public Works. Anywhere you got a water main going or water service to a building or a water main in the street, we can't go too far down because of the frost depth to protect that water main or the water service to a house.
I mean, as far as excavating to create a
freezing of the pipes.
I got you.
Right. Just a heads up. And I just have one clarification on the elimination of the vegetables. Are those eliminated, or were those possibly, they say leafy vegetables? I mean, is that going to be clarified somehow? What's a leafy vegetable?
John, because the first thing that comes to mind when I think leafy vegetables is lettuce. And I do not think that lettuce would make a really good parkway planting. It would probably be wonderful in the vegetable garden in your backyard, but I don't think the parkway is a good place to be planting.
Yeah. And a layperson, and how does a layperson distinguish leafy? A tomato plant has leaves. I mean, that's not leafy in my mind. I know what they're talking about, but just to be really clear on what can be put in there.
Yeah, I think Liz might speak to that, because I think she and Matt list the types of plants, and maybe that should be revisited. As we said, this is just sort of a draft.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay.
What do you guys say about that?
I have a healthy selection of leafy vegetables in my parkway, dandelions.
You can eat dandelion greens, you know that.
And if you can get one that a dog hasn't peed on, they're not entirely bad for you.
You know what? And let's go back to your tree preservation. Does that really kind of put a big damper on all of this if we're gonna not be able to plant stuff below the trees?
You can plant below the trees. It's just you can't. It was the structure issue you have to get a permit for.
Okay.
And people just need to be thoughtful, and if they put a shovel in the ground and they hear a thong, they need to stop.
Right. Okay.
How about I give the, I'm sorry. you
Oh, I
were
just
gonna-
was gonna bring up that this, about the digging, that EFC had talked about this and, about, whether putting in something to, call Julie before you dig and all that stuff. And ultimately decided not to, specifically say that. Because I think we felt that it was, when you dig, you're responsible for what you dig and, you have to call Julie. That's sort of a state mandate, I believe. I also, one of the things that I brought up and we talked about it is, and I think part of the idea of making this, when we talk about all these specifics, right, you can always find an exception and something that is going to cause a problem. And I think that was part of the reason the EFC moved towards making the guidance much more principle based rather than detail based. And I'm going to bring this up here. I had suggested, and I think it's still something to consider. The village, just like the community development director has the ability to, make changes to zoning. If you disagree with that decision, you can go to the zoning, to the that board, the zoning board, and they can review that decision and they can, make, they sort of as, quasi judicial adjudicate that decision. Maybe something like that would be useful here, having a, a lot of the decisions being made by staff, but then if a resident really is passionate and really wants to do something, I think that's appropriate, having some sort of mechanism where that could be reviewed. So
that's something to think about. Clearly we don't at council want to see every application for a parkway planning because we have enough of that already with playhouses and the like. So, but that is a good point, Ted. And that's something I think as a council we have to think of is, would there be an appeal process if somebody had a proposal that was turned down by staff, and should we? What do you think?
I think you should, no different than something that's zoning related or planning related. There's got to be a way to appeal it.
Yeah.
Because what if you had
could rest
we
on
have one on staff now, a rogue administrator that doesn't approve anything.
Well, I
There's got to
think
be a way around it.
I think if we're going to do that, we need a very tight list of what's acceptable. Otherwise, we will get a lot of appeals. And I do think this, as I look at this, this can grow low. 36 inches to me isn't low. I just think we just need to tighten it down and that it can't be certain. 36 inches to me is a bush, or I can plant something that I really can do, with a root ball. And I just think for certain things like that, if the purpose is to keep the parkways looking fairly uniform, but have some other benefits to it, I think we just have to be a little bit tighter in how we're going to look at this. And I think this is wonderful work, by the way, absolutely wonderful. But
how big does your stuff grow in the parkway? Ted?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to me, but I missed that first. I missed that first Ted.
I have moments like that all the time where I think.
So I wasn't sure you were talking to me, but then it seemed like I was the only one there that could answer that question. You have to understand, right? That I followed the process, based on the council's directions from the 1970s that no one can find. That Steve Saunders, I filled out it's funny, right? The form was from the 1970s, but I filled it out and Steve Saunders and we talked and we decided. And so, the stuff that we planted, none of it's big. It's all it's all like seedlings. It's all like perennial stuff that's going to over time grow. So
does it mean 36 inches grow?
Well, I don't, if you want, I can look it up while I'm sitting here and see what they might be. But I know that it was designed because we have a neighbor on the Tree Street that actually has a grandfathered driveway just down the thing. So it was, the plantings were chosen not to be too tall to, or too bushy, full to interfere with that sight line. But they're going to probably grow to, I'm going to say 3 feet. I would be surprised if they didn't grow to 3 feet or maybe a little bit more, but they're not going to be like Joe Pye weed, which grows to like 6 or 7 feet. You know what I mean? So I mean, it's not like you're dropping a you know, something that's pre-made into that space. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna evolve organically. So, I mean, we picked plantings that are smaller, but I mean, you know, in order to have this work, I mean, the plantings, you know, have to have some height. I mean, they're gonna have some height. You know, even a flower is a foot tall. you
Yeah,
know?
I'm with you, but depending on the plant, you're also now affecting sight lines with children in the street and cars and things like that. So I just want to be very careful with this.
Yeah, that's exactly what, I mean, I know that was you know, when we got our approval from Steve Saunders, when we did this all, you know, we have a guard, you know, well, we use Craig Bergman now, but they're very, very smart. You know, we worked with their their native horticulturalist, and she, you know, came up with plantings and, you know, an arrangement that all, you know, took all those things into account, you know, sight lines and, you know, how close it was to the driveway, and, you know, that it would look nice, not be too bushy, you know, not be too full, all that. So yeah, I think it's the document that would be required to, like, you know, it would become like the tax code if you wanted to talk about every single permutation, you know?
Yeah.
And what happens in your case, Ted, if the village has to come through and excavate for some repair of something that might be below there or through there? Is your understanding that, you know, no cost to the village, right?
No, I mean, but it's like, yeah, of course, it's, you know, I know it's not my property. I understand that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I personally, you know, sort of disagree, you know, I disagree with most of the ideas of structures, although, you know, historically the village has allowed, you know, like curb cuts in some of the Tree Street areas, which are phasing out. And, you know, there are other things that have been done. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, I think structures are beyond where we should be going. But I mean, people have to understand, right? If you plant something there, there's a chance that it might get, you know, ripped up if it has to make way.
Yeah,
I mean,
right, definitely. Right.
I kind of think like when someone was mentioning about like other people that have spent a lot of money and time, like landscaping, you know, the Parkway, because they didn't realize it was Parkway.
Right.
You know, I feel sort of the same. I think it's the same idea. I mean, it's really not the village's fault or the public's fault that they didn't understand. I mean, you know, just like we were talking about the event with the person that put in the planters. I mean, it's not our fault that they did something where they shouldn't have. I mean, if the village comes along and says, you know, we need to do something, you know, a homeowner that spent tens of thousands of dollars putting in, you know, I don't know, a line of, you know, 30 foot, you know, 20 foot tall bushes. I mean, we're sorry, but, you know, you should have checked.
No, I just wanted to have that input. Thank you. Wasn't giving you a hard time at all.
Oh, no. I mean, I totally accept it. You know, I mean, I put it in there, I spent the money, and I hope it doesn't get ripped up.
Yeah, no, right. But, and if I guess in the permit process, you know, it's got to be very clear on the permit application or whatever, that is clearly stated for the village's stake.
Yeah.
That in the event something's got to be done, it's going to be left as back to grass or something. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Kristen, could we see if anybody out in the audience wants to chime in?
I'd be happy to, Chris. Liz, did you have your hand raised to
I'm
speak?
sorry.
Thanks, Kristen. I did. That's okay, Chris.
Where are you?
Thank you. Sorry. I don't know. I'm right next to you in my Hollywood Squares game. Ooh, and Andy is Paul Lind. That's kind of perfect. Okay, sorry. Sorry, it's perfect. Okay, so sorry, and then I lost Rob. He shuffled too. There you are. Okay, hi, Rob.
We can tell
Sorry.
who's old and who's not.
I know. Everyone needs to know about Paul Lind. So Rob, on the height issue, I totally, again, I feel you, and I think it's hard to get it. It's hard to sort of capture what the range of like a height and what that means width wise. And all I can say is we agree that 36 is definitely on the high side. 30 inches for what it's worth is almost exactly what every other community that has any other parkway standard goes with. It's obviously it's a max, and it's not like we're encouraging every planning to get to that height. And as Chuck started, I think he very wisely guided our efforts on the EFC to stick with this principle-based thinking about it. And it gets at this like differentiation in our yards, not just the not knowing where our yard, what's parkway and what's not, but the easiest example I can think of is, a pure tree street plot like where Ted is versus an Indian Hill plot where you might be able to have 36-inch tall grasses or even a bush, and there's not going to be any sightline issues, obviously, but the whole aesthetic might be somewhat different. And so that's why we recognize there's got to be standards, but there's also got to be flexibility. And again, it's sort of going to the sort of yards that work idea. It's going with whatever you need in your space, right? So it's what, that's sort of what you can put in there is automatically somewhat limited or defined by the space you have, how big it is, face, and whether it's shaded and all that. So we're not trying to encourage everybody to plant 36 feet bushes, and some of the grasses, it's like, it's just like it provides like texture and provides, and then it does provide some nice, I can't think of the word. I don't have the vocabulary. It does remain in the winter. You have something more to look at. It's not just dirt and ground. It just provides more, I was going to say structure. That's not the right word, obviously. Depth, something to look at. That's not just ground cover. And again, I think it's what we're all trying to do, everyone here, is just make the best use of these spaces. What's the best use of the parkway space? The highest value, I think Andy referred to it at one time in a conversation, that the best use, the best value of it. And in our village, that seems largely related to stormwater, but there may be other non-stormwater related reasons to not only have turf grass in those parkway spaces. Better for soil, better for runoff, better for pollinators, better for the environment, for the atmosphere, that kind of stuff. But yeah, lots of variability, but nobody wants bushes, sorry, where they don't belong, where they're going to cause a problem. So that was all hopefully taken into account in our deliberations.
Great. All right, Kristen.
At this time, if anyone in the audience would like to make a public comment, if you could raise your hand using the Zoom platform. President Rentz, there's no raised hands in the audience, but I just received an email in my inbox regarding this issue. Would you like me to read that email?
Sure, bring it on.
It was sent to Contact Council. Hello, I hope you're doing well. First, thank you so much for all you do for the village. It's a great place to live. Thank you for everything you do to make it so. Second, I saw that the issue of the garden in the parkway on Cherry Street was being addressed at tonight's meeting. So I wanted to share my thoughts as I am a Cherry Street resident. Overall, I am against the garden in the parkway, and here's why. This resident has plenty of room in their front and back lawns to have his garden there. Why not do that when having his garden in the parkway is against village ordinances? 2, the north side of the street is for parking. This is the side of the street that the garden is on. The garden makes it difficult for people, especially people with disabilities or mothers with young children, to access their cars. 3, it affects property values. Not all people find this garden attractive. I do not. And having an eyesore on the street negatively affects property values. Other neighbors purchase their homes assuming the parkway would be maintained as a grass space, and that expectation should be honored. 4, it opens the village up to lawsuits. If it's village-owned property and the garden is damaged by municipal work, snow plows, etc., the owner of the garden could sue the village. It opens up the village to lawsuits if it is grown there that causes an allergic reaction to a child or pet.
And who,
And this comment has requested to be kept anonymous at this time.
Okay, going forward, if an individual isn't willing to lay claim to the words that they are espousing in public, then we're not going to read them. I mean, I will give deference to this individual this evening, but that's the last time we do that. If there's a request for anonymity, then they don't get to talk. I'm sorry. This is a public meeting, which means, and it's not, I'm not chastising you, Kristen. It's just, that's very irritating to me to have somebody call somebody out like that and not be willing to be responsible for their words. So there's way too much of that out there in the world right now. And in council chambers, we want people who are going to talk to us and with us, not anonymously shout from the street. So anyway, thank you for that. This person will be happy to know that the court date on that is now June 4th, if I'm not mistaken, Rob. And at that point, we'll be pressing for, what are we pressing for anyway? Maybe Ben, you can help me with that. What are we doing in court?
Yeah, Ben, this is with the village prosecutor and not with
I'm sorry.
Friedman. It is a local citation. And that local citation had been continued a couple times to allow this conversation to proceed. The date is June 4th, and we'll be asking for removal. Of course, if it's removed prior to June 4th, the citation would be dismissed.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping, the homeowner to just acquiesce and look what all the work that's been done and just remove it. This is silly.
Well, it's being cultivated as we speak, so that's even more frustrating. But we'll deal with it. All right, I'd like to bring it back now into the room here, and I just want to run over what I've heard tonight, because I like the idea of the principle-based design. Some of the things that are struggling is because it really is a qualitative sort of standard rather than something that we can measure and weigh and quantify in a million different ways except for the height. And that's all going to fall on Andrew's shoulders if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Rob?
It would fall under Public Works and Department of Engineering, as it depends upon how we revise the permitting process. I think if it's tree related, it would fall more towards in Andrew's purview. If it's more of a parkway planting, it would be most likely engineering. So you probably bifurcate those, but they may cross review depending upon what is actually being proposed.
Before we get this to a document that the council can act on, I'd like everybody on village council to consider something that just popped into my head. Seems to me that because of the qualitative nature of this, that it might not be a bad idea that these applications get reviewed by one of our advisory boards. And maybe it's the EFC, maybe it's Plan Commission, I don't know. But because of the fact that we can't say specifically that these certain items are acceptable and these certain items aren't, that there is this artistic aspect to it that I'm a little uncomfortable just saying, well, we'll have staff sit back and make those rulings. I don't know, Rob, what do you think about that? Bayhan.
Well, having a set of standards and it's from which to review an application is always helpful. Of course, there's going to be, whether you have those specific standards or not, there's always going to be submittals that may not fit exactly what you have listed. Perhaps, as you were suggesting, President Rintz, one of the advisory boards to review it for the first, I don't know, a year to 18 months to see how it goes, and then it might be able to be delegated to staff. But if you want that extra community-based review, that might be the way to go, since the recommendation is more principle-based than specific standards.
Chris?
Well, go ahead, Rob, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Tough.
One quick question. I just want to make sure I'm trying not to create a lot of work for anybody, but I guess I have a vision of two things came up. You talked about it being like the different artwork, so there's really bad artwork, as you know, and I wouldn't want to put in my front lawn. If you're looking at a tree-lined street that has 30 homes and 15 people do different, just as you're driving down, you go from manicured Parkway to 15 different people doing 15 different things, you're gonna have some pretty upset neighbors, is my guess, who moved in and thought they had a certain look, and we're now giving, I kind of thought the original thought would be good, we'd be doing low ground cover that would help drainage. And if we're gonna allow 15 different variations to 15 different homes on 15 on the street, I just think you're gonna create, if we're really not a little more precise, you're gonna get the village in a mess, or whoever is reviewing this in a mess, you're gonna have neighbors complaining. So I just want to make sure we know what we're getting into as we do this.
Well, I mean, and I think that's where an advisory board actually adds value, because they can look at some of these issues as contextual is a big issue, right? And if you see that you've got a certain rhythm and character on a block face, maybe they would look at that and say, well, you need to be more consistent with what's already there, or whatever. I don't know. I can't imagine how this is all going to play out, because we've never seen anything like this before. But you make a good point, Rob, that there is a certain level where it doesn't work anymore, despite all of the physics of stormwater control and green technology and all the other stuff, which I'm not very well versed on. But yeah, I get it. And understand, we're not writing an ordinance tonight. I'm just trying to get a framework for something that we can have another discussion on this once Rob has Ben frame out something as a starting point. Go ahead, Penny.
I think of this like somewhat like the design review board, where there are a set of standards, and there's a certain amount of aesthetic and technical element that I think the EFC could bring to this process, at least at this time. So I think Chris, that's a really interesting concept, and maybe as time goes on, it becomes clearer in terms of what we're looking for, and it would be easier to administer. But I think at this point, as we introduce this program, I think it may be meritorious to think of it like the design review board. A plan is submitted, and then it's reviewed by the EFC using their expertise. So this is a thought.
Yep. Go ahead, John.
Maybe part of this process is maybe there's, these plants are allowed to be put in without a permit. If they're friendly to whatever EFC believes, maybe it's a small 12-inch ring of ground cover around a tree, hostas, go for it, do all you want. If you get anything bigger than that, I'm concerned that if you're allowed a 30-inch bush, every other house is just going to go out there, put a bush in, and call it their front yard landscaping. Yeah. So the next step, I think, almost requires, I would think, if you want to make it right, possibly a landscape architect.
Guys, can I point out something? Because I think we're losing sight of something here.
Okay.
What's that?
None of this is a recommended change to the status quo.
Right.
At all.
Right.
You currently can plant up to 30 inches, whatever, but you have to go through the permitting process, just like Ted did. And that process produced a really nice result at Ted's house.
Right.
And we have not had a rush of people trying to do this.
Yeah, it's not an economical rush. I mean,
we're, we can go out and recruit more Teds to our village, and we should do that. But I think barring that, we should not be worried about like, oh my God, this is no change at all. This is the status quo.
Right.
It's just what we've gotten is really helpful recommendations for things people should be thinking about when they go through the existing process.
Right. And I agree with you, because what Ted did, he went to professional, I believe.
Yeah.
Came up with a great plan.
And he worked with our village staff, and they came up with something that made sense.
Right. good.
Well,
And then
it works.
my last two comments, I think I'll be done then, is during this process, let's pretend someone spends 10, 15, $20,000 on their parkway or right of way plantings. There has to be some kind of document that says they maintain it to the look of what they planted. Because 5 or 8 years down the road, it could be a disaster or the next homeowner. And how does the village remedy that in the event that we have to go in there and maintain it or rip it out and plant grass? Is there any deposit possibly or something on that end of it? I'm always thinking negative, sorry, but.
So
Are you an attorney or an architect? I'm always curious, John.
a couple of the things I wanted to add to the existing process, and I'm glad John mentioned that. I thought, well, first on the principles, the one principle I would add, it kind of reflects what Rob and others were talking about, is that, you know, we'll take into consideration consistency with the surrounding area and appropriateness for local conditions, right? So what may be appropriate in the tree streets may not be appropriate in Indian Hill. So I would suggest we just add that as something that they ought to be thinking about in the process. John, I agree with you. I thought we should, in the permit process, which we already have, and if this isn't already in there, and I think it might be, is something that says that the permit is subject to review at the village's discretion to ensure appropriate maintenance. And, you know, look, if the thing grows out of control, you know, it could become something that we didn't intend. So I agree with that. So what I would suggest is, you know, we've got some good information that adds to an existing process. I would add, you know, that additional principle to the extent we don't already have it in our permit, some kind of, like you're talking about, John, like a, you know, like a review, so it could be revoked. I would not recommend, it's hard enough to get people to do what Ted has done. I would not recommend we put that through a full board because there just hasn't been that need yet. But, you know, look, if one thing we have done in other situations is if someone's unhappy with the result at the staff level, that they could appeal. But I think it's also important for us to remember that the thing that did set all this off didn't go through that process. And
right.
We've got really good, knowledgeable staff.
Yeah. President Rins.
Yes.
To Trustee Kreit's point about consistency with local areas, I would suggest that the permitting and the public education differentiate between a traditional parkway like you may see on the tree streets versus a not defined parkway. But we also have islands in the community. We also have the boulevard, which is over at Mr. Winnichenko referred to with the little library. We should make those distinctions so that we can better define what is consistent with the area. Because when you look down, and if you recall from Steve Saunders' PowerPoint in December, you look down Hibbard Road and you see different types of plantings that are technically in the right of way that are growing up a bit, but their trees weren't allowed because they would interfere with the power lines. So that local area flavor, I think, is pretty important, as you mentioned.
So, okay, I got it, Rob. That's a good point. So, well, John, did you have one last thing? You said you had two.
My two were the maintenance and deposit possibly for replacement, repair, whatever.
It could be part of the permitting requirement, you know, the maintenance requirements of the permit.
Yeah, and if there was a money requirement, maybe there's a separate fund that money builds up into in case we have to go in and tear down a property or maintain it properly. And then maybe on the boulevards and the islands that you talked about, I guess to make sure that when you define right of way, it doesn't cross a road and become the boulevard in the middle.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
But even alleys should be defined, right? As you said.
Right. It's a right of way, not a parkway.
There is something in the code we can tap into to address that, John. There's and I forgot where it lives, but there's a thing that assigns homeowners responsibility for their parkway area. And they have, so you would just define whoever, you know, you have the right to possibly do this or apply for a permit to do this over the areas with a parkway that you have responsibility for under the code. There's a way we can connect that.
Yeah, and I guess technically the alley is also a parkway. It's the area between your property and the street. So it doesn't have to be your front yard.
Right. Well, I think, let me summarize what I've heard at least so far tonight. We need to define what the applicable and available spaces for the improvements is. Talk about islands and boulevards and the like as well. But we really need to define what actually can be developed and what areas are completely off limits. It sounds like we need a firm definition of structure because, you know, Penny, you brought it up with bricks or rocks or anything like that. So, you know, clearly when we get to that point, I think we really have to work hard at making sure that structures includes all the things that we're concerned about. The planning height, you know, it was a 36. I hear Liz say everybody else is doing 30. Rob, I know, still has some concerns about that, and that's something that we're going to have to talk about and maybe understand the plant materials better. Because I could see that, you know, maybe 1 or 2 30-inch sticks isn't the same as, you know, a 30-inch bush, right? So there's some issues there that I think as council we'll have to wrestle through when we get to that point. Appeal, you know, that concept and whether appeals would go from Andrew to the EFC or how that would work, but that's, you know, there should be an appeal mechanism, it sounds like. Maintenance of the installation with a potential deposit. I'm not sure how that would work either, because it sounds like that's almost a little punitive if you want to do this, to have to put a deposit up and then leave the money in account, but something to talk about. And then Andy brought up again the principle of context, or understanding the appropriateness of a certain installation at a certain time. And that's kind of what I got out of this. I think if there's anything else that's front of mind right now, I'd love to hear it. But I think based on what the EFC has given us, and we start to think a little bit more about those issues, I think we can start to get something that'll get us to maybe a modified ordinance and in the not too distant future. But we still have some work to do clearly on this. Go ahead, John.
Sorry, one more. So as you started talking about, you know, the right of way plantings, whatever you do, when someone sells the home and buys the house from somebody, how does that homeowner know that they're responsible for maintenance of that parkway if it's been improved?
Well, Andy just said that the code covers that, right?
Yeah, the code requires you to maintain
So no matter what was built there, they got to maintain it.
You got to maintain it, which is why I don't think we should be doing deposits. There's already an existing legal obligation every resident has to deal with. So.
Okay, all right.
And if someone doesn't like what you did, they'll just come and clear cut it just like they would in your backyard anyway. And, you know, pave it over, you know?
Okay, all right, good, thanks.
Would that someone be the village, Ted? Is that what you're inferring here?
I mean, I didn't really infer that. I wasn't planning on inferring that, but I can see I can see where it's going. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We do all this hard work, and that's what we get after we invite you to the table.
I'll get my Ted measure.
Hope you understand I'm just joking with you, Ted. So
thank you all. This was I wanted to say one other thing. You know, this started maybe in a funny way, and I'm hoping that situation ends well for the homeowner, but you know, we can't control everything, but I think something very good has come out of it because of the work you all did. So thank you all very much.
yeah, awesome work. I was really impressed, even though it wasn't voluminous, it was really heavy. So thank you so much for that. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
Nope, thanks for everyone's work.
I'm just happy I'll just be happy to see when you get rid of the form that references the resolution adopted in 1976 as the current form.
We'll put that at the top of our list, Ted.
I think this focuses on our communications, and that scattered throughout our website are different pieces that you all have done, you know, in terms of stormwater management. You know, we're that document that we can pull it all together and put it in the sustainability under the sustainability icon so that people can find it in one place, because there is a lot of great material in there that you all put together, and I want to make sure that it's accessible. I went and dug around and it took me a while to find it. So let's put it out there. You know, it's great stuff. So thank you.
I just added communications to the list. I remember we talked about that earlier.
Yeah,
but
yeah, right.
Definitely, we have to have a good communications.
Agree, great start, and thank you guys. And Ted, send me a picture of your yard after the village we wax it for that last comment of yours.
So, all right, well, I guess this is interesting. We have 2 adjournments, right? Rob, is that how this works?
Correct.
So
there's a motion from one.
Chuck, why don't you go ahead and adjourn first?
All right, do I have a
Okay,
motion?
Ben?
Do I have a motion to adjourn the Environmental and Forestry Commission meeting?
So moved. Oh, sorry. Seconded.
Roll call vote, Andrew?
Andrew?
As Commissioner Winnichenko
Aye. Yay.
and Commissioner Kunkel.
Aye.
That's everyone.
Great. All right, well, then I can do the same thing. May I have a motion to adjourn the village council study session?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call vote, Rob?
Trustee Swerk,
Yes.
trustee Apatow,
Yes.
trustee Lampier,
Yes.
trustee Mancini,
Yes.
trustee Craig.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. I love study sessions. They are just the best. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, gang, we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, bye.